We've just got one last very quick talk about enforcement. Over to Lara.
I will keep this very brief, I promise. You might think once you're holding your judgment in your hand that you're almost at the end of the road. But unfortunately, particularly with fraud cases, there's still a way to go. And we've already spoken about the various measures that you should ideally take in order to preserve assets, so there is something to enforce against at the end of the day. Hopefully you've stopped your defendant dissipating all of his assets. Something to remember with freezing orders is that often they'll expire on judgment, and so you need to apply for a post-judgment freezing order to ensure that the defendant can't dissipate assets once the judgment's been granted. You might also want to take local advice where you're looking at enforcing abroad from local lawyers as to the particular measures that are available there to gather evidence, freeze assets there if you don't already have a freezing order in place. If your defendant, if there's a particularly high risk that he's going to dissipate assets and the freezing order isn't going to provide enough protection, then you might have obtained a receivership order where you have receivers, typically accountants, managing and controlling the defendant's assets. But again, if those assets are located around the world, then you need to make sure that that receivership order is recognised in those various jurisdictions to allow the receivers to take measures there. There are certain things you need to watch out for where you're enforcing a judgment abroad. If you're fortunate enough to obtain a default judgment, then you might think, great, I've just got to go and enforce that against some assets elsewhere. But lots of jurisdictions won't recognise default judgments because they're not judgments on the merit. And that can be a real advantage for a defendant. They might have taken the tactical choice not to defend the English proceedings, but with the aim that once the claimant tries to defend the judgment abroad, they can raise their objections then. And that's obviously often when you'll see really spurious grounds being raised, which an English court just wouldn't entertain. Some countries outside the EU charge on enforcing judgments, and that can be where you've got a big judgment, really quite a significant amount of money. Some countries require your judgments to be retried on the merits. That would be particularly unfortunate, and you'd hope that your lawyers had advised you of that when they knew that the assets were located in those jurisdictions. But essentially, the process can be very drawn out and costly, and that's something you do need to bear in mind when you're deciding where you're going to pursue your action in the first place. Extremely briefly, when you're looking to enforce a judgment in Europe, then the best way of doing that is the European enforcement order, because it's an extremely quick process when you've got an uncontested judgment, so a default judgment. You apply to the English courts, they issue a certificate, and it's as if the judgment's been issued by the enforcing member state. Where it's a contested money judgment, but still in Europe, then you're going to look at the Brussels regulation, or if it's a Lugano contracting state such as Denmark, then look at the Lugano Convention. Similar process under both. Essentially, just applies to money judgments and injunctions in civil and commercial matters. And the application has to be made to the enforcing member state, unlike the European enforcement order. Note that under the Lugano Convention, there are certain grounds on which the court can say we're not going to enforce it of its own volition, and that might be public policy grounds, or if they take the view the defendant hasn't had a sufficient opportunity to defend the proceedings. If you're looking outside Europe, then if you've got a Commonwealth country, then there are two acts, English acts, which will help you. But if there's no reciprocal arrangements in place, like would be the case with Qatar, then you're going to have to take local advice on the way to enforce the judgment. And again, invariably, where there's no reciprocal enforcement in place, then that can be an extremely drawn-out process. So the key message is judgment's not the end of the road, unfortunately. And again, take steps to ensure that there are some assets there at the end of the day. I'll leave it at that.